All right, there we go. I think we're starting now. Let me get this going on. All right, welcome back from spring break. It can be tough to sustain momentum after a break, so good job getting right back in. This week's text is arguably the toughest we will cover, although Rawls was, kind of tough sledding too as far as the reading of the text. Hence, I had you write brief responses write responses to brief portions of the text as far as your reading questions were concerned. My hope is that by viewing/reading this lecture, you will gain a better sense of what Kant was up to. So this week, it's the lecture in a sense that matters. You got a little bit of a feel by going into the text and trying to discern it. But I was basically just directing your attention to a few key principles, and we'll explain them here. Okay, now let's look at Kant's place in history. Many philosophers think Kant, Immanuel Kant is how you really pronounce it, who lived from 1724 to 1804, is the greatest philosopher in history. He is on pretty much every philosopher's top 10 list. He is most famous for his work on epistemology, which is the study of the nature and limits of human knowledge. He is also famous for his work on ethics and aesthetics, which is the theory of art and beauty. In regards to epistemology, Kant wrote multiple editions of a work entitled The Critique of Pure Reason. He starts the critique by criticizing past philosophers for setting out to prove a number of difficult theses regarding the nature of ultimate reality without first investigating what the human mind is actually capable of figuring out and what we are not capable of figuring out. He is often credited with having undermined the views of past philosophers who thought that important conclusions could be reached regarding the existence and nature of God, the nature of the self, the afterlife, and questions pertaining to the ultimate origins of time. Kant argued that as humans, we can only ever figure out how the world appears to us and not what the world is like in and of itself. Of course, our focus today isn't so much on his epistemology at all, actually, but I wanted to mention it because that's just what he's famous for. Gives you a little context, and it's worth noting that having seen himself at least his undermining theological argument about things like God, um, the afterlife, and that sort of thing, he felt like, okay, we can't use that as a foundation for ethics, so that's part of what motivated the development of the theory we're about to look at. Okay. All right. Kant is a bit like Rawls. In comparison to the ethical theories we have studied thus far, Kant's theory is most similar to that of John Rawls. Indeed, Rawls viewed himself as not only working in the social contract tradition of Thomas Hobbes, but as also walking in the footsteps of Kant. Kant, like Rawls, was in search of the rules one ought to follow in order to ensure that one was acting in a fair and just manner, although Kant didn't really toss around the rules, fairness, and justice. As you'll see, he ends up in a similar place. Rawls, if you remember, thought that the just rules could be discovered by imagining oneself as negotiating with others behind a veil of ignorance. According to Rawls, the just rules simply are the rules that would be chosen based on this process of decision making. Kant also argues that the correct rules, moral rules to follow, are the ones that emerge from a specific process of decision making or reasoning. However, Kant's process is different than Rawls'. As you can see from the title of this slide, we are going to address this week's reading questions out of order. We'll start with 3. What we will do here is state Kant's categorical imperative, which is his basic rule of right action. We'll discuss how to apply it, and then do some reverse engineering in order to shed some light on how Kant arrived at this principle. Okay. The phrase categorical imperative means a command that one must obey regardless of his or her interests. Moral rules, says Kant, and every philosopher we are studying this semester, are not the kind of rules one can opt out of. Obeying. The rules apply to us whether we want them to or not, regardless of what our interests happen to be. So imagine you're on a trial, you're participating in a trial, you're on the jury, and someone's being accused of murder. Well, murder's wrong regardless of whether or not the person cares about if murder is wrong, or whether or not the defendant is interested in doing the morally right thing or not. The moral rules are still binding on that person, the defendant, and that's basically what the phrase categorical imperative amounts to. It's a command or an obligation, you can think of it that way. It's binding on us regardless of what we think of the command. Okay. The rules apply to us whether we want them to or not. Okay, now, Kant also uses this phrase, categorical imperative, as a name, the name of his own guiding moral principle that he defends as the correct one. Here is Kant's guiding ethical principle, and it's at the top of the slide. Kant's categorical imperative: always act in a manner such that the maxim of your action could be willed to become a universal law. As you can see by the phrasing of this rule, the rule tells us to follow a decision procedure in order to figure out what the right action to do is. Again, this is how Kant is similar to Rawls. Now, what does this all mean? How does one act in a manner such that the maxim of your action could be willed to become a universal law? Well, the first thing we need to figure out, we're going to break this down into 2 steps. Step 1, what is the maxim of one's action? Well, the maxim of your action is a combination of your goal or motive and your intended means of achieving that goal. So consider the following case. Jill is at a job interview. She wants to become the next president of Data Tech, which is a startup that develops software relevant to data management. During the interview, she is asked whether or not she has had experience programming statistical hardware in the past, or whether she has just helped market such software. Jill knows that if she lies and says she does indeed have such programming experience, she's more likely to get the job. So she lies. What is the maxim of Jill's action? Well, her motive is to get the job, and her means of achieving that goal is to tell a lie during the interview. Hence, the maxim of her action is, I will lie during an interview, or this interview, if that helps me get the job. Uh, okay, we are halfway through applying Kant's categorical imperative. We've explained what it means to discover the maxim of one's action. Now we need to do the second part. We need to universalize the maxim in order to see what would happen if everyone were to behave like Jill. So let's just take a quick uh, peek back. Uh, oh, yeah, there he goes. Kant's categorical imperative. Here's the advice, or the imperative. Always act in a manner such that the maxim of your action could be willed to become a universal law. We've discussed what a maxim is. It's your motive and the means of achieving that goal. Now we need to figure out if the maxim can be universalized. So, one universalizes a maxim by imagining that everybody is willing to act, or in fact does act, on that same maxim. Hence, in this case, we are to imagine that everyone who interviews lies when telling a lie is likely to improve their odds of success. Could we rationally will this to happen if we were in Jill's position? Not really. This is because if everyone were to engage in lying during the interviews, then we could no longer conduct interviews. The whole point of interviewing, which is to discern who is actually most qualified, would be undermined. Another way of looking at this from a Kantian perspective is that lying is only an effective means of attaining one's goals if others presume that you are telling the truth. But if everyone lied and, everyone knew everybody was lying, there would no longer be a presumption of truth-telling, and lying itself would be a pointless activity. Hence, Jill can't will that the maxim be one that everyone acts on. This would undermine the whole point of her lying. Okay, now, let's clarify this. First clarification. Bad consequences are not the problem. Let me head off a misunderstanding of Kant commonly made by those first learning his theory. Kant is not saying that lying is bad because it's harmful, or that lying would be really harmful if everybody did it. He doesn't, at least not directly, worry about such things. Kant thinks the problem with lying is that one cannot be rational in affirming that lying is okay when it serves your ends. This is because if lying to serve your ends really was okay, then everyone could do it, and the activity itself would become pointless. Again, the problem is that lying would not be effective if it were okay to do, hence this undermines the idea uh, that lying is okay to do or moral. So if it was really okay to lie all the time when it serves your interests, and everybody, did that because it's okay to do, uh, it becomes a pointless activity, and in that sense is an irrational activity. Now, let's do a second clarification. Uh, it may be useful to once again compare Kant and Rawls. Rawls' process of decision making is one that yielded rules that were just in the sense that they were fair. The rules did not favor any one group over another, and hence were unbiased. Kant is trying to achieve a similar goal. If the success of one's action, for example, lying to get the job, depends on other people not behaving just like you are behaving, then you are exhibiting a powerful bias in your own favor. Checking to see whether or not the maxim of one's action could be universalized is a way of checking on whether or not one is trying to gain an unfair advantage. Now, the fourth reading question concerns the section entitled Second Formulation of the Categorical Imperative, Humanity as an End in Itself. Kant formulates a second moral principle which he thinks always produces the same results as the first. This secondary formulation is often referred to as the formula of humanity. So I will adopt that title here. Here's that rule. Here's Kant's formula of humanity. Always treat other persons as ends in themselves and not as a mere means to an end. Now, what does that mean? To treat another person as an end in herself is to treat her with respect and dignity, but to treat another person as a mere means to an end is to sacrifice her well-being for the sake of someone else's without her consent. Hence, this principle also dictates that we treat others impartially. We cannot make special exceptions for ourselves or those who we are closely associated with. We kind of have to treat everybody equally in the sense that we respect what he often refers to as their dignity, but we can't just override their will for the sake of what we want or even for the sake of the common good. Now, with these, now that we have reviewed the main thread of Kant's theory, let us now backtrack and review the answers to questions 1 and 2. Kant states in his opening paragraph that only a good will, which refers to a will that is guided by ethical motivations, is good without qualification. He then proceeds to argue for this by showing that other traits, which we usually refer to as being good, are sometimes quite bad. He gives a list of mental abilities and traits that we unreflectively kind of think of as good. Traits like intelligence, judgment, wit, perseverance, courage, and resolution are actually sometimes bad, even though we tend to think of them as good. In order to grasp why Kant thinks this, that these other traits are only usually good but are sometimes bad, consider some of the most evil persons in history. Stalin and Hitler will do. They were exceedingly intelligent. They knew how to judge the likely consequences of their actions. They showed fortitude and perseverance through hard times and stood firm in the face of danger. These traits, however, simply increased their ability to perform evil. They were both cruel and power-hungry dictators who killed millions of innocent people and positively delighted in cruelty. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi, Socrates, and other really good people, notice they have these same traits. They were also exceedingly intelligent, knew how to judge the likely consequences of their actions, showed fortitude and perseverance through hard times, and stood firm in the face of danger. The moral difference between them and the dictators just mentioned is that the moral heroes, like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi, are properly motivated. Similarly, Kant notes that gifts of fortune regarding one's level of wealth or success, again, we think of fortune as a good, but it's not an unqualified good, because it can corrupt one's character by breeding arrogance and other dangerous turns of mind. In contrast, a person with a well-motivated will, Kant argues, has something good without qualification. The will is what steers us, and directs us towards good or evil. And that's basically what distinguishes the good person from the bad person, says Kant. That guiding will. Now, why does Kant defend this? Why does he defend that the quality of one's will is the most important thing, ethically speaking? Uh, Whenever a philosopher spends time making a point, you want to ask yourself, how does this point tie into his or her greater project? Now let's remember Kant's categorical imperative. Always act in a manner such that the maxim of your action could be willed to become a universal law. This imperative evaluates the quality of one's maxims, that is, one's motivations and intended means of achieving that motivation. Hence, the morality of one's action, in Kant's theory, depends exclusively on properties of one's will. Hence, Kant is trying to establish the importance of operating from a good will at the outset of the book, where this is taken from. Similarly, whether or not one is treating others as ends in themselves or as a mere means to an end is a function of one's motivations. If Bob gives Grandma roses to make her feel better, she's sick, then Bob has Grandma's well-being in mind. But if he gives her just roses just to get into her will, he's only thinking of her as a means to an end. So this is, of course, the formula of humanity. Hence, whether or not Bob's action is morally right according to the formula of humanity is also a function of his motivations. So Kant, his two principles govern proper motivation. Hence, it makes sense that he'll defend the supremacy or the importance of a good will, even above and beyond having an action that causes good consequences. Now, question 2 asks, if you agree with Kant that even an ineffective goodwill is good in and of itself. In order to address this question, imagine Bill. Bill always tries to show respect towards others, and furthermore, he goes out of his way to help those in distress. However, Bill always fails. By some fluke, the money, food, or medicine never gets delivered in time, or the person he is helping turns out to be a con artist. Are Bob's actions still good? Or do they aim at achieving good results, but fail to do so? Hence making the will, maybe not bad, but certainly not good, because nothing good came out of the motivation. The utilitarian would answer this question in the negative and say a will that fails to accomplish a good goal hasn't really done anything good, or isn't anything good just in and of itself. This is because the utilitarian, of course, focuses on consequences. The Kantian is in many ways the opposite of the utilitarian, as what matters most is one's motives, and not the consequences of one's actions. Okay, that's kind of it for this week. Please proceed to the discussion board, where you'll get some practice applying Kant.